Jasper Sharp, as an expert on Japanese cinema, my first question is very simple but complicated at the same time. What distinguishes Japanese cinema from other countries?
Well, that is a very tricky question, and I'm not sure if necessarily you can point to any specific hallmarks that Japanese cinema has, because after all, there's so much of it. I think probably my interest is because there's so much of it. I mean, basically, Japanese started making films pretty much as soon as cinema began, and they've got a sort of well, nowadays you look at Japanese box office, and 50% of the films, over 50% of the films, are being watched by Japanese audiences. So, the point is that Japanese audiences prefer watching Japanese films to foreign ones, and you've got an output of about 500 films a year. So, it's really, for me, an area where you can constantly keep sort of exploring and finding new interesting stuff.
Well, I think we're very lucky to have them. They definitely keep it spicy and interesting. So, sorry, I'm going to screw it up. Hirokuzu Korida. Can you say it properly for me?
Hirokazu Koreeda, yes.
Much better, thank you. He's doing great work in Japan currently. Of course, Shoplifters, but also Like Father, Like Son, The Third Murder. Really interesting work. So please tell us about his rise to prominence.
Well, I think a lot of people would say that Japanese film is a bit wild and wacky, but I mean, it's only because I think that's really what the West consumes out of Japanese cinema. They see what they want to see, really, and so we've had a lot of the stuff like the Battle Royale, the Audition, and more the extreme stuff. But I don't know, I think Koreeda sort of fits that other side of international art house cinema, really, where he's making films for global audiences with a universal appeal. I think it's interesting that his career appeared around about the same time as people like Hideo Nakata, who made The Ring. They started off in the 90s. In the early 90s, the Japanese film industry was a bit of a low ebb. The studio system had collapsed, and so these sort of directors often got their background in television. And whereas someone like Nakata making The Ring started making sort of horror TV shows, that's where the sort of J-horror boom began. Koreeda began as a documentary maker, and so he made a couple of documentaries on one of the first openly HIV positive AIDS casualty in Japan, and also about a guy with amnesia, and another one about these called Lessons from a Calf, which was all about this very progressive school project where a bunch of elementary school kids looked after this cow, and basically every single lesson revolved around this cow. So they'd have to build its house, and then they would use their math skill to calculate how much feed it needed and that sort of thing. And then he emerged, he went into filmmaking sort of from this documentary background. Interestingly, I would always say he's got a very documentary style to him, or certainly a very, it's a very unflashy, non-stylized sort of style, sort of like documentary realism. But his very first film, Maboroshi, I think was very stylized in terms of its use of framing and composition and exploring time and space and other issues to that. I mean, I don't know if you've seen Maboroshi, tale of a widow and her young son as they sort of attempt to build a new life after her husband sort of commits suicide. But from that, I think what I found really interesting always about Koreeda was that over the years, his certainly the first half of his career was almost like a whole process of exploring what you could do with film form, and how different sort of techniques and forms would fit the subject matter better than others. So a film like Nobody Knows, which is really just a story of just 5 kids who are abandoned by their mother and left to fend for themselves. Everyone says it's very naturalistic, very documentary style, but I think the use of lenses to sort of really articulate this sort of very child's eye view of the world, I think is very masterful. Actually, is a lot more subtle than. I mean, he's an incredibly subtle, accomplished director. I think what we've seen in recent years, over the past 10 years, has been a case of he's gone a lot more commercial and makes more sort of soap opera style films. The focus is his earlier films focused on the dynamics of the family, but the later ones are sort of more specifically, tailored towards the sort of family genres and aimed at a more widestream audience in Japan. And so they've transcended. He's got this amazing sort of dual reputation where he can win prizes at Cannes, but also, his films make a lot of money in Japan as well.
Yeah, now he's working with Ethan Hawke.
Yes, I know. I don't know how that's going to pan out. I mean, it seems to be a rite of passage for a lot of directors of his generation, Naomi Kawase and Kiyoshi Kurosawa. There's another one called, I think it's Nobuhiro Suwa, have made films in France with a French, French cast and in the French language. They're never hugely accomplished result, or never quite as successful as their Japanese work. So if you bear in mind that often these directors don't speak French. I don't think Koreeda really speaks English. He certainly understands it, but I've interviewed him a few times, and he's always more comfortable speaking Japanese. So how that's going to work with the new film, I don't know, but I'm sure whatever happens, the results are going to be very interesting.
Yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic, I think, like you are. So when you introduce his films at events, what are some of your consistent comments?
Well, I haven't done that much. I mean, there's the new BFI box set, which features what his earlier cycle of films. I did the commentaries for Maboroshi and liner notes for Still Walking. I think I'm going to be introducing his work at a festival in the UK in about a month, the Chichester Film Festival. But I think a lot of Western commentary on Japanese film, whether it being applying to Koreeda or whoever, always sort of tries to focus on these sort of, Japanese traditions, or look at it in terms of Japanese aesthetics. And I think that's sort of a bit of a smokescreen. What I really love about Koreeda is his sort of the universality of his themes, I think. And anyone who has a family will understand the dynamics of a family. Certainly in a film like Still Walking, I thought resonated very well with me, this story of, a family gathering every year. They gather to mourn the loss of the dead son who died like about 10 years before drowning. And the point is that obviously there's still a lot of pent-up resentment which gets poured onto the younger son who hasn't quite lived up to the parental expectations. And I think that's something anyone can really sort of maybe not identify with, but recognize. And maybe it's because I lived in Japan for a while and I'm very familiar with Japanese people. So when people say, "Oh yeah, he was very culturally specific," and I don't really understand it, I think for me one of the points of interest in Japanese film is that once you get past this sort of surface alienness, you are looking at more, the fact that Japanese aren't necessarily particularly expressive or emotive. So you look at more the subtle details and nuances of the language they use, their body postures, positioning of people, how they relate to one another. And I think that's something we all do, but not in such a sort of showy, demonstrative fashion as would perhaps be conveyed in a Hollywood drama.
Very interesting. So, why do you dislike Takashi Miike? You told me that personally.
I don't dislike Takashi Miike.
Okay. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
I do sometimes. No, I sometimes like him and Sona Sion. When we started Midnight Eye, which was 20 years ago, you're probably aware that my colleague at Midnight Eye, Tom Mez, wrote the book on Miike. Mm-hmm. And we both discovered contemporary Japanese cinema around about the same time. So Tom was very much struck by Miike, and I was certainly bowled over when I saw films like The Bird People of China and Audition and the early cycle. But I always sort of left Tom to. Tom was clearly more passionate about the director, and I actually prefer sort of older works rather than the more the studio classics of 1960s or 1950s. So I sort of left Tom to look at Miike's stuff. But I think what happened was after Tom's book came out, there was a lot of his back catalogue got released on DVD, which to the exclusion of other probably more worthy films, because Miike's done some incredibly good films, but he's also done a hell of a lot of films. So I'm always curious about how you can make 3, 4, 5 films in a year and maintain any sort of consistency of quality and of vision almost. And I think that's what's happened now that Miike's now moved into different production circumstances and making bigger budget films. There's a lot more compromise about them, but I don't know if there's some dodgy stuff in there. I just means I've seen a lot of his early V cinema work, and it's not great. I mean, it's compromised by the budget or whatever, but well, I think it's just like focusing on any one director, as embodying a sort of cult Asian extreme thing. I find sort of it distracts from the other interesting stuff that's out there.
Okay, I think I see where you're coming from. And, of course, his we just announced today that his film First Love will be playing at Midnight Madness at the Toronto International Film Festival. So maybe he'll be coming around here.
The thing is, I don't really keep up with him now. He makes so many films that, it's not like someone like Kiyoshi Kurosawa, the horror director who did Pulse and Cure.
Right.
Makes films because he makes, a film a year or even less than that. When his films come out, they're always sort of a bit more of an event, and it's always interesting to see what he's going to do next. Whereas I do sort of get the impression that Miike does plough a similar furrow each time.
For sure. Okay, those are all interesting points. And Tom Mess, I've actually interviewed twice. He's a great guy. I really loved his books on Miko Kaji and the Lone Wolf and Cub series. I'm a big fan of that work.
Oh, yes, the new Arrow books, yes.
Oh, they're fun. You can read it in one sitting. It's great. I love it. Anyways, before we get in a little off topic, what are your thoughts on Hollywood's latest Godzilla film? And do you believe the Hollywood Akira remake is doomed, sort of different territory now?
Well, I don't know, because, it's like, I'm going to confess, I haven't watched the Hollywood Godzilla film.
The new one?
I'm not really interested. I sort of have, conflicting thoughts on this whole idea of Hollywood remakes. I guess the thing is that whether they're better or worse than the originals, it doesn't really matter, because they bring in a new audience and a new attention to the sort of films we're writing about. So I don't think that's a bad thing. I think in terms of Akira, that's going to be a similar case probably to what happened with Ghost in the Shell, in that I don't think there's the mass audience out there for whom Akira is deeply embedded enough within their own past that they're going to be interested to go and watch it. So it's a case of over-investing in the property, that everyone thought, there's big arguments about whitewashing and everything with Ghost in the Shell, but at the end of the day, most people would never seen the original Ghost in the Shell. It's just, it's very easy for people like us who are into cult cinema to get very hot under the collar about sort of things, but I just don't think most people would bother. So for them, it was just like a new Scarlett Johansson film.
True.
So I don't know what's going to happen to Akira. If it does get remade in live action version or whatever, I mean, I'm probably not going to go and see it, I'll be honest.
Okay. I appreciate how candid you are. It's definitely refreshing. And yeah, it's like definitely like I think it was the same with Suspiria. You anger a lot of people, and then the people who like Call Me by Your Name aren't going to really like that necessarily. But yeah, so good.
Yes, no, I totally agree. And I don't know, there's just so many films out there at the moment. So why watch
Yeah.
something that's, maybe you can watch it and come at it afresh with new eyes or whatever. I would never watch the new Suspiria film thinking it was ever going to be in any way similar to what Argento did with the original. So,
It's not at all.
which is one of the film that's, deeply part of my own, film viewing habits and,
Oh, yeah.
and one of my favorite.
Yeah, I love Dario Argento. Many Japanese films are incredibly strange, as you touched upon, and it's sort of a surface thing that you're discussing. But what do you believe are on that specific point? What do you believe are the sociological factors for that? The strangeness within the cinema.
Ooh, that's a good. I wouldn't want to psychoanalyze a nation. I don't know.
I have a
again, as I
didactic
say,
approach,
there's like
but yeah.
500, 600 films coming out every year, and only a small fraction of them make it to the West ever. So maybe the question should be, what does that say about us? That we watch stuff like Guinea Pig and Naked Blood and Pink films and Miike and stuff, rather than, I don't know, dramas about kids bonding over a dog or something.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. Maybe we just like to see.
The one thing I have learned is it's very difficult to generalize about Japanese cinema.
Yeah.
I don't know. I like the 50s and 60s stuff a lot. The melodramas, people like Naruse and Masamura, and I think they're just good, powerful dramas. And I think in the good old studio heyday, when the factories churning out these films, that there was such an amazing technical sort of there's the crew of technicians and the cinematographers, and I think on a visual level they really are quite distinctive and just incredibly polished, and the Japanese could always achieve a lot on a very low budget. So I mean that's part of my passion, I think, just how strong and how many good films there are out there.
All right. So the next question you are going to like. It's about Akira Kurosawa, who I think you would agree is considered the best, widely considered the best post-war Japanese director. And I was wondering, what do you think distinguishes a Kurosawa film from his peers at that period? And what do you think of the claim that came from Japan primarily that he was a westernized director?
Yeah, I think that was to do within the internal politics of the Japanese film industry, in that there were a lot of, because he was quite young when he made that, in terms of when he made Rashomon, which was like the very first Japanese film that did really well in 1951 at Western film festivals. I think there were a lot of older Japanese directors going, who is this young upstart that's sort of getting all these prizes with his second film, whereas I've been making films for decades.
Right.
When we started Midnight Eye, was this 2000, year 2000, so it's almost 20 years, well, it's 20 years ago now. We wanted to, everyone was basically talking about Mizoguchi and Ozu and Kurosawa. And so we sort of figured, well, let's move the focus away from them and see what else is out there. So the interesting thing is, I think Kurosawa was one of the last of those big directors we ever really wrote about at Midnight Eye. So I've heard the accusation that a lot of Japanese people, but also a lot of Western critics who specialize in Japanese film will say that Kurosawa is not really a Japanese filmmaker. But I mean, whatever that means, I don't know. That his films are very westernized, and it's certainly true that he was, very much inspired by John Ford, and on a dramatic level, on Russian literature and Belgian crime fiction, and obviously the Shakespeare adaptations. Every time I watch a Kurosawa film, I just think they're astonishing pieces of cinema, whether they're typically Japanese or not. I certainly think, Ran, the King Lear reworking, I think, from the 1980s has to be one of the greatest films of all time. I wouldn't say he's a film I sort of, if I had like an evening free and go, what should I watch tonight, I would gravitate towards Kurosawa. I'd probably go to other directors, but I certainly think he's, definitely, you can't discount him.
Yeah, I really enjoyed earlier this year reading the Stephen Prince book, The Warrior's Camera. I thoroughly enjoyed that. And of course, he did influence, Sam Peckinpah with multiple cameras in the Seventh Samurai, and the whole myth stuff with George Lucas. Obviously, that's big in Star Wars.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating that he was influenced by Western art forms, and we gave the influence back. It's this continuous dialogue, which I think is really interesting, in a way that perhaps stuff like the Ghost in the Shell remake or the Akira remake aren't really a dialogue, but attempt to sort of efface the original, shall we say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree with you with the universality of it. Like I interviewed Marcello Fonte last year, who was in the film Dogman, and I asked him, about, is this great for Italy? Is this good for what kind of Italian movies do you like? Do you like Sergio Leone and stuff like that? And he said, sort of similar to what you seem to be saying, is I like beauty from anywhere.
Yeah. I think because there's a lot of stuff like Mizoguchi's films from that period were very much playing on that sort of period decor and these sumptuous camera movements, this beautiful cinematography that evokes sort of Japanese woodblock print, and then Ozu was very much this zen-like stillness, and so you could read all this obvious Japaneseness into them. Kurosawa just knows how to hold a beautiful shot and come up with very big dramatic scenarios. So personally I would say I prefer Ozu's films, but at the same time, Ozu did pretty much do the same thing over and over again, where I think Kurosawa, was in a constant state of reinvention. So amazing film like Throne of Blood, the Macbeth adaptation, is so different from the crime thriller Stray Dog.
I love Stray Dog.
I just think he's great.
Yeah, he's really fantastic. So another director that we both admire is Seijun Suzuki. He's a very accomplished...
yes. No, he's one of my favorites.
Yeah, he's really cool, and I love his approach to his genre, the Yakuza film. But I was wondering, sort of another didactic thing, why do you think he's better than Kenji Fukasaku? If you were to compare and contrast, why would you make a case for Seijun over Kenji?
Oh, I think this, for me, it's just like a case of taste. It's like music, isn't it, really? It's just, I like Fukasaku, and I think the Battles Without Honor series are brilliant. I mean, they were reflected a very different time. They were the anti-classical Yakuza movies, so they were done in that very raw, abrasive style, which is a bit like listening to hardcore punk, isn't it? I mean, it can be a bit exhausting, right. Like being battered around the head with a brick for a while. So, there's no denying his skill as a filmmaker. I like them, I respect the films, but I prefer Suzuki, who's a lot more playful. And I think the problem is Suzuki's always been dismissed as someone who made frivolous nonsense films. There's that thing, I often see it circulating around the internet about my films, in my film's time and place, my films are nonsense or whatever. And this was basically from an interview, I think, which is on the first Criterion release of Branded to Kill, which is just like one frame grab, which was part of a larger thing, a larger discussion when he was explaining why he was fired from Nikatsu, because the boss of the company was obviously peeved at him and said, we don't need a director who makes nonsense films that make no money. So this has been taken as read that this is what Suzuki himself thought. You look at his films. I mean, I was very proud to work on the Arrow box sets of Suzuki's early works, and they're not as flamboyant as stuff like Tokyo Drifter or Branded to Kill or even Gate of Flesh. But he made good, solid. He was an inventive filmmaker, and like what I said about the studio era, there was just this immense skilled group of technicians. The cameras, the lighting, the set design, everything was just so perfect in creating these sort of uniform worlds. And I just think, considering that films like Take Aim at the Police Van or I don't know, The Boy Who Came Back were essentially B movies, they were just incredibly well made B movies. I think, in terms of the later Yakuza films, you can see as soon as the budgets get bigger, or just the sheer pace of his filmmaking, that he obviously was experimenting more and more. He was given similar plots each time, so it's like, how do we stage this in a different way to make it more interesting? But I think by the time you get to things like Branded to Kill, what he's really doing is exploring how do you almost convey narrative purely through visuals. It doesn't matter if the story is sort of silly or doesn't make sense. It's just the fact that you're being taken on an emotional journey into sort of almost surreal I don't know, Freudian, Jungian world where just like of color and black and white and form and movement, and I just think he's not given the credit he's deserved. I think a lot of people dismiss him as frivolous. I just think he was just like a master filmmaker.
Yeah, I love Youth of the Beast as well.
That's discounting the fact that he did make films with fairly weighty subjects like Story of a Prostitute about the wartime comfort women, and Fighting Elegy is definitely his masterpiece. It's sort of this rise of fascism in Japan as told by teenage kids in the playgrounds.
Nice. Fighting
each other with razors and big sticks.
That's cool. I love in Branded to Kill the whole number game. And it kind of reminded me, I was like, this is like Afro Samurai with the number 1, number 2 headbands. And it was the first thought that came to my mind, but it is an incredible film. It's
almost like it's like cinema reduced to pure abstraction, as I said, and it reminds me, of course, the Point Blank at the time, the John Boorman film is quite similar as well. The sort of existential gangster films.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
But of course, we haven't really touched on the fact that this was just his stuff he did when he was churning stuff out for the studios. But then, of course, there's the Taisho trilogy in the 80s, which pretty much do the same thing, but with an art house format. So a lot slower and longer, but just there's this attention to color and form and just slight surrealism that he brings to them, that I think if you do know a bit about Japanese culture and Japanese history at the time, they are actually incredibly rich viewing experiences.
Yeah, they rock. They're so cool. And again, like it's the difference between Seijun Suzuki and Kenji Fukasaku. Like Seijun's maybe like I want to listen to jazz, and Kenji's like maybe I want to listen to punk rock, like you say.
Yeah, I think that's that. You totally hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah, that's good stuff. And I like the thing. I like the punk rock analogy because the Battles Without Honor series, it's really impossible to keep track of all the different plot lines going on there. I like it though. It's cool.
I just find you're racing to keep up, and then suddenly all the cards fall into place at the end, and then you get that final battle, and then you get onto the next one. It's like, oh my god, that was great, I want to watch the next one, and then you're still thrown in the deep end with the next one as well, and you sort of begin the process all again. Incredibly chaotic. I love them.
They're great. Anyways, to shift gears a little bit, in the UK, a very cool director is getting in a box set, Mr. Josef von Sternberg. So what can you say about your contributions for that set? Because that's coming out soon, right?
My source of fascination at the moment is the actress Anna May Wong. So my contribution was a bit of talking about her role in Shanghai Express opposite Dietrich, but more specifically, I'm doing a bit of research at the moment about what she was. I mean, she was in London. Basically, she based herself in Europe for quite a long part of her career between sort of 1927, 28 up till 1935. She sort of came and went, and based in London a lot. So I'm curious. I find it interesting that within the context of the racial politics within America at the time, she wasn't getting roles in Hollywood films because of she wasn't getting lead roles or romantic roles because it was the Hays Code. You couldn't have interracial romances really. So a lot of the time she played these sort of vamps, these dragon women, prostitutes, whose main purpose was to, lure white men to their demise by being, seduced by this evil Chinese woman. And I won't say the roles she had in British films were that different, but they were subtly different, and I think that's what's interesting, the way the media reacted. I mean, she was primarily treated as a Hollywood star in Britain, and there's that dichotomy of whether she was seen as a Hollywood star or a Chinese star. I mean, the irony is that she didn't go to China till 1936. She was born in the States, in the second, third generation Chinese, and didn't go until she was about 30. So she was sort of there, meant to represent to the entire world, this sort of embody this sort of Chineseness and the Chinese nation at a time, and she came under a lot of criticism in China for sort of showing Chinese characters in a bad light, but it's the way she was cast. So I don't know, I think she's really interesting.
Okay, well, our interview is, I think we have we have over half an hour, and I really appreciate your time. That was a great conversation. So thank you very much, Jasper Sharp. Before I let you go, where can people find your writing and follow your endeavors?
Oh, well, gosh, yes. Well, Midnight Eye is, of course, still up and running. We haven't contributed to the Midnight Eye site. Hasn't been updated for about 4 or 5 years now. There may be plans afoot to resurrect the Midnight Eye brand, but we'll wait and see. But otherwise, yes, liner notes for Arrow, for the new BFI box set of Correator. You can see me on the British Sternberg Dietrich box set. And you might even want to try checking out the film I directed, co-directed with Tim Grabham, The Creeping Garden, which is nothing to do with Japanese cinema, nothing to do with Asian cinema, but is about plasmodial slime molds. It's a weird science documentary.
Groovy. And I also saw you have on the BFI website, you have articles, and you're on Twitter.
Oh, yes, the BFI website. I sort of fairly regularly contribute to them, and also Sight and Sound magazine as well.
Oh, nice.
Write reviews for them.
All right,
whoever will give me a job, basically.
No, that's good stuff. That's how you have to be. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, great. Well, thanks. Lovely speaking to you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.